Good morning. I'm delighted to welcome you all to today's symposium. Too big to fail or too hard to remember. Lessons from the New Deal and the triumph, tragedy, and lost legacy of James M. Landis. My name is Bill English, and I'm the research director of the Edmond J. Safra Center for Ethics here at Harvard, which is co-sponsoring this symposium with the Center for Law, Markets, and Regulation at the University of New South Wales. The ostensible topic of today's discussion is financial market regulation. Some 5 years after the end of the financial crisis, it's safe to say that we're still struggling to come to terms with all the lessons that the crisis has to teach us. From the conflicts of interest that likely biased rating agencies, to the accounting tricks employed by firms like Lehman Brothers, and the questionable securitization and sales practices that have led to massive settlements with Citigroup and Goldman Sachs, the financial crisis has provided fertile ground for investigating what we at the Ethics Center call institutional corruption. That is, cases in which economies of influence have diverted institutions from their legitimate ends and led to crises of public trust. Although there have been many legislative responses and regulatory and judicial responses to the financial crisis, including the massive Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act, it's still not clear that these responses have addressed the most significant weaknesses and liabilities in our financial system. Many have suggested, for example, that financial institutions remain too big to fail and could be in a position to require bailouts again in the future. The recent case of JP Morgan's loss of some $6 billion through the rogue trading strategies of Bruno Iskel, aka the London Whale, also suggests to some that the banks have become simply too large to manage as well. Doubts about the regulatory foundations of the global financial markets have only been magnified by the recent LIBOR and currency rate manipulation scandals. These scandals have already generated billions of dollars in fines and created a crisis of confidence in one of the most widely used financial benchmarks. As the economist Danny Roderick has noted, markets are not self-creating, self-regulating, self-stabilizing, or self-legitimizing. Rather, in order for us to reap the tremendous benefits of markets in a changing world, we have to pay close attention to the institutional structures and the beliefs that shape how markets function, and to use this knowledge in service of the common good. Well, today we have 4 truly distinguished experts to help us think through the principles of financial market regulation, and to do so in conversation with history and with the extraordinary and complex legacy of James Landis, former dean of Harvard Law School and one of the principal intellectual architects of the Securities and Exchange Act of 1934. Speaking first this morning will be Professor Justin O'Brien, who directs the Center for Law, Markets, and Regulation at the University of New South Wales, and is a visiting professor here with us at the Ethics Center. Justin's remarks are based in a book he has just published, which is on its way from Waltham, I understand, if you want extra copies at the end. A book he's just published on the life and legacy of James Landis. Daniel Coquillette, Charles Warren Visiting Professor of American Legal History at Harvard Law School, will then respond. Then in our second session, we have the rare treat of a sibling panel. Judge Jed Rakoff of the Southern District of New York and Todd Rakoff, Byrne Professor of Administrative Law at Harvard Law School, will discuss what has happened to the concept of the administrative process as articulated by Landis, as well as address contemporary regulatory design questions, and we'll give them a more formal introduction when they come to the stage in the second half. Without further delay, then, let me turn the floor over to Justin O'Brien, who will speak about regulatory policy and the life and legacy of James Landis.
Bill, thank you very much indeed, and thank you very much for the Safra Center for organizing today's event. This has been a real labor of love for me, writing this book on James Landis. For the last 12 years, I've been investigating corruption on Wall Street. My first book on Wall Street was called Wall Street on Trial, A Corrupted State, ? I think we can get rid of the question mark at this stage. The second book then looked at the politics of enforcement, looking really at the regulatory response to Enron, WorldCom, and associated crises, and what happened to regulatory legitimacy in that process. And the third book in the trilogy was called Engineering a Financial Bloodbath. Now, this was not a return to my journalistic roots. This was a direct quote from Mike Smith, the head of ANZ Bank in Australia, who, when asked to account for the bank's poor performance in 2008, said, well, if you think this is bad, go to London and go to New York and see for yourself a financial bloodbath. And of course, this didn't happen by accident. It happened as a consequence of very complex yet very brittle financial engineering. Since then, I have traversed the globe looking at the Forex and the LIBOR scandals. We've had a series of 4 workshops, including one held here in May. But it struck me that as we went through the crises, that somehow we had seen it all before. The problems of too big to fail had been dealt with in the 1930s. The problems of complex financial instruments had been dealt with in the 1930s. And it struck me that it was quite important to go back and look at the history of financial regulation to see to what extent could we learn some lessons. And that process brought me directly to James M. Landis. And so I've spent the last 3 years here in Harvard excavating the archives, spending a lot of time up in the Elliott Root reading room here. And it struck me looking at Landis's papers that we have lost sight of something really quite profound. And that is that the disclosure paradigm so closely associated with Landis is not an end to itself. It is a means to an end. And that normative underpinning, which really was at the heart of how Landis operated, has been lost. And I think we've lost something really, really important in the process. And this brings me to the opening quotation that I use in the book. And this is from a speech that Landis gave in March 1937 at the Catholic University of America, in which he was speaking to students and faculty members about the purpose of education. And he argued that one grasps for shadows the better to comprehend sunlight. One reaches into the past more clearly to know today and tomorrow. It is the privilege of all who care about education to test the depth and quality of that shadow, for there, perhaps more than anywhere else, one must try to pierce the brilliance of continuing dawns. Landis was one of the most pivotal figures in establishing and legitimating external oversight of the capital markets, and at the time was ruminating as to whether or not he should return to the academy. An outsider, born in Tokyo in 1899, he had risen to the very apex of bureaucratic power. And there he had put into practice the ideas that animated the progressive jurist Louis Brandeis, for whom he had clerked after graduating from Harvard Law School. His public service for the Roosevelt administration, his connections in both Washington and New York, and his preference for evidence over unsubstantiated assumption had guided initial success, including at Harvard itself, where he became a tenured professor in 1929 at the age of 29. Not surprisingly, Harvard's law faculty, as well as the university itself, was keen to see his return to Cambridge to navigate the relationship between Washington and the country's preeminent legal educational establishment, not least because of the rapid expansion of the federal bureaucracy. As a legislative scholar, draftsman, and regulator, Landis knew few equals then or since. While other prominent members of the Brains Trust were better known at the time, none, with the exception of William O. Douglas, a mercurial self-promoter perhaps, who inveigled his way to the SEC and from there to the Supreme Court through, in part, the patronage of Landis, had such pronounced influence in regulatory policy. 4 years on the front line of what were at times vicious debates over whether and how to impose restrictions on freedom to contract had, however, taken its toll. The SEC, the agency that Landis had been instrumental in designing, had survived initial Supreme Court challenge, notwithstanding criticism from the bench that its methods risked application of unaccountable and arbitrary power. It was an accusation that Landis treated with barely disguised contempt when, in a major speech in Chicago, just 10 days before the Catholic University address, he accused a majority of the Supreme Court of writing their own individual economic prejudices and predilections into the fabric of constitutional law. Such trenchant criticism of the highest court in the land reflected intellectual bravery. It also demonstrated a willingness to engage in partisan disputes in equal measure. It also reflected a personal commitment to the praxis between cutting-edge academic research and policy development. For Landis in 1937, a further tactical and strategic challenge remained unresolved. How and through what mechanism to institutionalize what he saw as the ideational gains of the New Deal. The challenge consumed him as he oscillated between the academy and regulatory and private practice over the next 3 decades. It was a quest that was to prove his personal undoing. In 1963, Landis was publicly humiliated in the federal court of the Southern District of New York, where he was convicted and sentenced to 1 month's imprisonment for failing to file income tax returns. Commuted to forced hospitalization on the orders of Chief Justice Sylvester Ryan, the ruling sent an unambiguous message that none could be held above the law. The case and its handling had profound political implications for the Kennedy administration, which had mandated a substantial reorganization of regulatory agencies as a result of specific recommendations made by Landis to the president-elect in December 1960. In prosecuting the architect of the New Deal for what amounted to be a misdemeanor, the Department of Justice felt it had little choice. Landis was to become a victim of political expediency. An already brittle personality cracked under the strain. Landis entered a downward spiral into alcoholism and depression. His personal and professional life disintegrated. Despite the suggestion by Chief Justice Ryan that Landis could once again aspire to greatness, the judge was no doubt aware that the defendant would probably never recover. He never did. A year later, he was found dead, floating in a swimming pool 3 weeks after being suspended from legal practice. The tragedy was complete. On his death in July 1964, the New York Times noted that Landis had achieved the rare distinction of being regarded as a conservative by liberals and as an extreme liberal by conservatives. What drove him remained elusive throughout his life. As an early extended profile in Fortune magazine put it following his nomination to the SEC in 1934, the gaunt, hawk-like scholarly professor had one talent lacking in certain of his confreres when he came to Washington. He knew how to keep his mouth shut. So he remains the unknown that he was the day he stepped off the train from Boston. He was to remain socially distant throughout his career. He continually sacrificed friendships for the allure and transformative capacity of power to effect social change. A more distant appreciation in the Harvard Law Review noted that Landis was on fire as a student. It also epitomized an illustrious public career informed primarily, but not limited to, his stewardship of the disclosure paradigm that underpins securities regulation. He was the critical architect of the Securities Act governing new issuance and the Securities Exchange Act of 1934, which extended regulatory oversight to existing securities and mandated associational governance with the exchanges through the establishment of the SEC. He served on the agency's inaugural board, becoming its second chairman with the public endorsement of his predecessor, Joseph Kennedy. Integrating enforcement with attempts to guide industry towards what he saw as socially beneficial outcomes was at the core of Landis's view of regulatory justification. He never saw the regulatory agency's role solely as that of policing. He maintained that administrative law and the administrative process could, should, and did perform a crucial task in operationalizing initial democratic choices and subsequent political mandates. At the same time, he was profoundly aware of the challenge of ensuring appropriate accountability mechanisms, the failure to attend to which would leave the entire project subject to judicial criticism. Through a combination of tactics and strategy, there can be no questioning his mercurial shrewdness in establishing and legitimizing the regulatory state. A review of his writings and experience demonstrates that throughout his public life, Landis had not sought power for personal material benefit. Rather, he recognized from the beginning that tactical success at the regulatory level was subject to shifting political priorities. Strategic success required shaping the trajectory of the legal profession as a whole. In Landis's worldview, a lasting transformation of American political and legal discourse could only be achieved through the praxis between regulatory practice, academic thought leadership, and critically, a sense of professional obligation that put service ahead of client interest. Such an integrated approach to legal theory and practice made him one of the leading policy entrepreneurs of his time. And there was no better place to effect such a transformation than through stewarding the strategic direction of Harvard Law School, the alma mater from which he, along with Felix Frankfurter, had built up the field of administrative law. It was no surprise then that later in 1937, Landis did accept the position to lead Harvard Law School. As only the fifth dean in its history, he took over from his professional nemesis, Roscoe Pound. For the next 8 years, drawn increasingly to a succession of government assignments as the university operated on a skeletal basis during the war years, he was to lay the foundations of a transformative academic agenda that encompassed but extended far beyond regulatory politics. Just 1 year after his appointment as Dean of Harvard Law School, he was to pen the administrative process. This retrospective theoretical justification of the regulatory state remains his abiding public legacy. It's less remarked upon how Landis was forced to manage and at times fall foul of the existential conflict between political calculation and administrative integrity. And nowhere was this conflict more evident than in his appointment as the deportation examiner in a 1939 case against trade unionist leader Harry Bridges, a case that transfixed the United States. The ruling and its rationale, which was subsequently overturned in 1942 on overt political grounds, gives granular articulation to the ideas that shape the administrative process, a book that Landis always meant as a preamble rather than a definitive text. The political damage caused by the Bridges hearing, however, had blunted Landis's capacity to engage at the highest levels of the political establishment. The death of Roosevelt in 1945 meant he lost critical political support that was only truly re-established with the election of John F. Kennedy in 1960. For the young president lacking in executive expertise, Landis was a critical resource whose long association with the family provided a basis for trust. The subsequent Landis report for Kennedy on how to rejuvenate the administrative process reflected just how far from the ideal the regulatory agencies he was so instrumental in midwifing had deteriorated from original purpose. It was, however, a challenge that Landis was unable to implement in practice. In part, this can be traced to the rise in professional lobbying, which had significantly reduced Landis's capacity when serving as the chair of the Civil Aeronautics Board in the Truman administration, a position he lost in 1947 by voluntarily resigning before being pushed. In part, it was also compromised as a consequence of the secret investigation into his tax affairs, which forced a progressive removal from public office. His fall from grace lost the academy and the policy community a vital voice as political discourse began to conceive government as the problem of, but not the solution to, the complexities of contemporary life. 80 years after the creation of the SEC and 50 years after the death of Landis, there is much historical and contemporary value in revisiting the pivotal conflicts that informed Landis's career as a practitioner and as a scholar. Indeed, the issues they raise of regulatory authority, legitimacy, and accountability continue to resonate. They remain some of the defining, if intractable, problems of our time. What are the appropriate limits of government? Can or should administrative agencies displace the judiciary? Is the relationship between executive agencies and government truly independent or interdependent? What constitutes or should constitute expertise? What accountability mechanisms should or could be put in place to guard against the arbitrary exercise of power? From the design of the disclosure paradigm in 1933 through to the Angel Island deportation hearing in 1939, to his report 2 decades later to President-elect Kennedy, Landis and his vision were central to the formulation and implementation of regulatory theory and practice. Critical to that process is the critical question of purpose. For Landis, the question of why one regulates is of paramount importance. Of necessity, this requires an ongoing dialogue between the regulator and the regulated, and the subservience of vested interests to the public good, which in turn has to be politically mediated. How to secure the legitimacy of such intervention remains foundational to regulatory authority. This is in no way to downplay Landis's own responsibility for his downfall. The tragedy, the result of hubris, willful blindness, and procrastination in equal measure, was totally avoidable. More importantly, however, we have in the process lost sight of the normative underpinnings of the disclosure paradigm, which he was so instrumental in building. It is time once again, as Landis admonished, to grasp in the shadows the better to comprehend sunlight. Thank you very much.
Good morning. I first of all have to apologize. I'm going to have to duck out a little early from the roundtable to give a lecture at Boston College, but I could not on any account miss this occasion because working with Justin O'Brien, reading his scholarship, and now looking at this extraordinary new contribution to what we know about legal education and administrative law, this is a very, very special moment. And I think we are all very much in Justin O'Brien's debt at every level. And also a great treat to be with my learned colleagues, Todd Rakoff and Judge Jed Rakoff, the two greatest practitioners on the one hand of Landis's legal educational philosophy, that's Todd, and then in the courts, of course, Judge Rakoff in the Southern District has been a great instrument in pursuing Landis's vision. Let me just say a little bit about what I'm up to. There's several members of the Harvard Law School History Project in the audience. We are not remunerated. It's a labor of love. We're, for the bicentennial of Harvard Law School, we are putting out a 2-volume bicentennial history. The first volume, which is the safe volume, goes up to 1910. That's done. But we have gotten up to Griswold now in volume 2, and that means that the chapter on Landis has been written. And I want to talk a little bit about Landis's other side. We've heard about how important he was in the world of government and in the world of economic regulation, but Landis was also incredibly important in the world of legal education, and many of the things that today we take for granted were in fact implemented and invented by Landis. Now, if you walk around the school, you will see the portraits of every dean of Harvard Law School hanging on the wall. That is, except one. Landis's portrait is not there. And the reason, doubtless, is the tragedies at the end of his life. And I have a little more to say about that at the end of my talk, because I think that today, with our understandings of mental illness, we would have treated Landis's problems with a good deal more sympathy. But His portrait is not there. It is not to be seen. And yet, his contribution to this school and to law schools across the country, not just in terms of pedagogy, but as Justin has said, in terms of his ethical and normative approach to legal education, been just extraordinary. So let me first of all point out one just astonishing fact. If you look at Landis's actual effective time as dean of this school, it really is about 3.5 years, no more than 4. He was appointed came in 1937 to replace what had been one of the great citadels of administration, the Roscoe Pound, Abbott Lawrence Lowell combination. Those two men supported each other. They were a powerful combination. People like Felix Frankfurter thought far too powerful. And they cast the school in a conservative mode, despite Pound's sociological jurisprudence. When it came to curriculum, he refused to look and touch in any way at the core of the LLB program instituted originally by Langdell himself. So when Conant replaces Lowell, one of his first jobs is to force Pound out. By this time, Pound had embarrassed the whole university by accepting an honorary degree from the University of Berlin. This is long after Hitler was chancellor. Traveling widely in Germany in 1934, he kept the company, Brucker and other leading Nazis. The unsealed papers in the university now show that Conant himself was deeply alarmed. So it was a great relief when Conant could move Pound out, and when he looked around, Landis was his man. He was his man first because, like Conant, Landis understood multidisciplinary approaches to serious problems. And secondly, like Conant, Landis had a moral and ethical approach to higher education. So he was in office from 1937 to 1940, when the school essentially shut down. Criticism that Landis abandoned the school, as Justin has pointed out, is just simply wrong. The school shut down. There were about 20 students left, and Landis was given a huge job by Roosevelt, the head of civil defense for the entire country. A lot of us today think, civil defense. That's with 20/20 hindsight. Had the Battle of Midway gone differently, had Hitler succeeded in developing the nuclear weapons he had been working on, civil defense could have been a very different matter indeed. And Landis took it very seriously. And at the end of his time as head of civil defense for the entire country, Roosevelt made him the minister to go and represent United States interests in the Middle East, the place that has tied us down now for decades. Landis was one of the first people to understand the dangers of the Middle East, to understand the problems it would represent on the long haul for America. It was from positions of this importance that he was induced to come back to Harvard Law School, mainly because Conant was furious that he wasn't here, in 1945, and he stayed 1 year, then went back to Washington. So 4 years, 37 to 40, and 45 to 46. Now let's take a look at what this man did in a 4-year period as dean. First of all, we now know that Roscoe Pound and Abbott Lawrence Lowell had an approach to education which is very difficult to defend today. Only controversy is to how much was Pound simply intimidated by Lowell, and how much did he share Lowell's views. We know that Lowell had secret courts to force people who were homosexual out of Harvard College. We know that Lowell wanted to reduce the number of Jews throughout the university, both students and faculty. We know that Lowell was strictly opposed to the admission of women to any of the Harvard schools, and had a vision that the governance of the country was best left to the graduates of elite private schools and distinguished families. Frankfurter's view was that Pound was simply intimidated by Lowell, but there's no doubt that this combination was toxic in terms of the student body of the school, and the primary selective device here was failing people out at the end of the first year. Landis replaced that system with a modern admission system. He was a pioneer in developing scientific aptitude testing. My students hate the man who invented the LSAT, but it was designed for a very good purpose, which is, in the past, predictions as to success in the first year were based on the history of other graduates of a school at the law school, Princeton, Dartmouth. But what about Wyoming? What about University of Tennessee? What about the kinds of places that Landis wanted to reach out to? We didn't have much of a track record. So aptitude testing was designed to get students into the school who were bright but came from non-traditional sources. In addition, Landis felt it was wasteful and cruel to use the first year as the primary sorting device. And it was his effort throughout the first 3 years of his deanship to reduce the failure rate at the end of the first year and to predict more accurately what students would succeed or fail. Throughout his deanship, he promoted Jewish faculty. He was deeply concerned about anti-Semitism wherever he encountered it. He was, of course, one of Frankfurter's proteges and Brandeis's too. He was a tremendous counterweight to what had gone before. He had only one failure in the area. It was one that he worried a great deal about. He focused on it as early as 1938, and that was the exclusion of women. Like many things that Landis did, he set in motion developments that Griswold could later take credit for. And women were admitted just after Landis stepped down as dean in 1950. He missed a great opportunity there to be historically the first dean to admit women. But this is he transformed a law school admission, not just here, but in other law schools throughout the country, in a way that made it a much fairer, much more open process. And he really is the author of modern law school admissions policies. Now, curriculum. A little while ago, Todd Rakoff wrote an article with somebody known as Martha Minow, now dean, about changing the core curriculum in the first year by adding, among other things, a required problem-solving course, and also a course focusing not on case law, but on regulation and legislation. It will be of no surprise to any of you here that at age 37, as the youngest dean in the history of the school, one of the first things that Landis focused on was the absence of this type of course in the curriculum. Now, he had an excellent platform to work from. In 1934, well, he had taught, as a faculty member, he had taught courses like this and promoted them. But in 1934, at the end of Pound's administration, the faculty was in revolt against him, and they used this revolt as an opportunity to study the curriculum. And there was a major report in 1934, and another major report that Landis himself sponsored in 1947. And of course, Frank Michelman is here in the audience, and he authored the third major curricular report. These reports are great moments in the history of the school, because the school, whether they're implemented or not, the school steps back and looks at itself. And Pound's view was that the LLB curriculum ought to stay exactly as it did under Langdell, should not be touched in any way. And the way in which you promote multidisciplinary work and promote advanced work is through graduate study, through LLM and SJD programs. Landis had a very different view. Landis's view was that the modern world of regulation and legislation required that the average law student know a lot more about this new world. It wasn't enough just to train a small group of specialists. The experience of the average graduate of Harvard Law School or any law school ought to include a new perspective on how law could be a tool through legislation and through rulemaking, and how it could be integrated with economics and also with jurisprudence to be a more innovative and effective in meeting the needs of the future. Now, to have a new curriculum, to set up a new curriculum, requires faculty. And the third major achievement of Landis, admissions curriculum, was faculty appointments. And again, he has never received the credit. But let me just go through these names, and you'll understand. He appointed 9 new faculty members while he was dean. The first 4 were appointed in 1940, just as he would leave to go to Washington. And they were A. James Kasner, Lon Fuller, Paul Freund, and Milton Katz. All 4 household names today in taxation, in legal philosophy, in constitutional law, and in international law. 4 great names. And then when he returned at the end of his deanship in 1945, he appointed 5 more. David Cavers, pioneer in conflict of laws; Robert Bowie, great international lawyer who became head of the CIA; Robert Braucher, one of the great commercial law specialists; Mark DeWolf Howe, legal historian; and Archibald Cox. I mean, when you're looking at these names, Kasner, Fuller, Freund, Katz, Cavers, Bowie, Archibald Cox, Mark DeWolf Howe, this is the nucleus of the faculty that made Harvard great in the next 2 to 3 decades. And Landis got them in. Also notice that Landis is appointing Jews, and that's something that Pound was very reluctant to do, and he made even more offers to Jewish candidates that were turned down. Now, let me get to the 4th contribution that Landis made, and in many ways this is one that affects us all in this room, and it's a moral contribution. Landis was always a superstar scholar. I mean, he came from a dirt poor background, missionary family. He never had any money. He worked his way through Princeton by helping dumb, rich students pass the examinations. Not that there are any people like that at Princeton anymore, but that's what he did. And his perspective when he came here, he was widely regarded as the most brilliant student anybody had ever seen. Pound, who did not take to him personally, said that he was, without a doubt, the most brilliant student Pound had ever had. There's no question that he excelled in every way. Now, you would think that a man like this would see the world through an elite lens, but he didn't. Landis spent a lot of his time worrying about the average student and the student at the bottom of the class. Now, the way he tried to address the student at the bottom of the class was to see that students who really couldn't make it didn't get in. And he felt that was charitable. And that, of course, is our philosophy today. But the students in the middle of the class, they didn't make law review, they didn't, they weren't a part of Frankfurter's hot dogs and recommended law clerks to Brandeis. What about them? And Landis worried about them a lot. And he implemented a series of reforms directed at the quality of their lives in the school. The first was his effort to reduce class sizes. Now that he was not immediately successful about. The class sections were 135. I was in a section 135. It's a terrifying thing. He wanted to get them down to 80, 85. And he wasn't able to do it, in part because of financial pressures. The school still owed a lot of money to the university for building a building it couldn't afford. I didn't make that joke. That's it. You laughed. But they simply were not in a position to reduce enrollment. His goal was to get enrollment down to 1,000. He wanted the school to go from 1,500 to 1,000. And he felt that would greatly improve the average student experience. He also wanted to reduce the class sizes in the second and third year. He wanted to implement seminars that every student, as of right, could be in a seminar, and that these seminars would focus on research and writing and be taught by full faculty, so that every student would have an intimate experience with a full member of the faculty. He also wanted to get students involved with the faculty's intellectual life. So he founded law school forums in which faculty would give papers, but where the students were all invited and were encouraged to ask questions and to criticize. And so there'd be an exchange between faculty and the students. And he implemented many workshops. He thought that it was too bad that students didn't have more opportunity to publish. So another one of his goals was to greatly increase the number of student periodicals, and he started with the Harvard Law School Record, which he founded and which was originally quite an academic journal. So he wanted to make the life of the average student here more intellectual, with more content and more connection, meaningful connection with the faculty. Finally, he thought the spaces were intimidating, and they weren't warm and welcoming. So he established the LSU Root Room, where students could come and relax and sit by a fire and read a newspaper. Many of the things that he envisaged in 1937 and 1938 have now come to pass. And in many ways, the vision of this building that we're sitting in is a continuation of Landis's concern about the quality of life of the average student. This was a moral concern. He cared about them. He cared that they had a decent education and that they came out of here committed to ideals of public service. Phenomenal. Now, the tragedy of his life. Why have these things been forgotten? Why is there no portrait for the man who invented modern law school admission, for the man that invented the curricular reforms that have now been implemented by Dean Minow and Todd Rakoff, invented the kind of building that we're in right now, invented concern for the average student, appointed a world-class faculty beyond any doubt. Well, of course, there was the scandal of his relationship with his secretary, and that was the first one. That shocked Cambridge in 1938, but also there was the tax. Now, here's one thing about that tax business. He wrote out his tax returns every year. He calculated the amount of tax he owed. He put the money in an escrow account that he didn't touch for any personal purpose. In other words, he does no defense of inadvertence or neglect. He felt in every return. He was crazy, crazy. And in the trial, everyone urged him to take a psychiatric defense, and his psychiatrist said, "This man it has no evil intent." As he testified, I never intended to deprive the American taxpayer of a dollar. I had all the money set aside. Crazy. And I think today we would treat that not as a crime, but as somebody who was really disturbed and with much more compassion. I do not believe he committed suicide. I don't think he took his own life. The medical records indicate it's much more likely to be a massive heart attack. But so there's a little defense of the tragedy. But even if we accept the tragedy in the way in which it's been created by mythology, it's no excuse for a school like this not to have acknowledged the debt to this extraordinary man. At his memorial service, Milton Katz, whose career he had supported throughout, got up and said, I prayed to God for Landis. I prayed to God to give him strength, because greatness he did not lack. From Done on Bacon. greatness he did not lack. So I think we now have, for the first time in a long time since Ritchie, a great book on Landis. The account of Landis's time here at Harvard Law School will be coming out in a year. I thank you very much for this opportunity to speak to you.
Any questions?
Yeah.
So we have a few minutes for questions before we're going to take a short coffee break to allow the transition for our next panel. But particularly on the historical biographical aspect of this first panel, are there any questions? I'd like to lead with just a quick one on the concept of administrative law and where it was at before Landis comes into both the law professorship and comes into Washington. I know from the political science literature there's in the previous 20 years, the real development on the ground in the United States of what we come to think of as a professionalized bureaucracy. What was Landis's major contribution to either the form or execution of regulatory law in the United States, for those of us who aren't specialists on the law side?
Justice?
It was one of Roosevelt's primary kind of like ideas post-inauguration to do something about basically the capital markets and to transcend basically a reliance on freedom of contract and replace it with a disclosure obligation. The problem that they found, however, was each attempt to create a workable regulatory structure totally failed because it didn't take into adequate consideration the actual operation of the marketplace. And I think it was Landis's great success in actually designing in the Securities Act something that was actually workable. And I think here's where the real tragedy is. In large measure, the aim of the Securities Act was to try to get industry itself to accept a moral obligation to society. And that was at its core. So yes, there was a policing function, but much more importantly, there was a belief that if we can work together to deliver through disclosure, truth in securities, we might actually have a functioning market in which integrity serves as its core purpose. The problem then as now is that industry has consistently and continually negotiated in bad faith. So in many ways, the strategy of 1933, 1934 remains very much in place. Secondly, I think it's important when you look at, say, for example, William Douglas's tenure as head of the SEC, in which he was regarded as being really quite an aggressive enforcer. This was in the context in which basically the legitimacy of the SEC had itself been actually reinforced by Supreme Court decision-making processes. So it did have the capacity, for example, to implement the Public Utility Holding Company Act, which was the 1930s equivalent of too big to fail. So too big to fail was a problem within the public utilities. How do you deal with that? You deal with that by imposing what was called the death sentence clause. You broke them up. But you could only go through the process of breaking them up if in actual fact you had legitimated the regulatory process itself. And it was very much Landis's stewardship of the SEC in the early years that created the circumstances that it could survive and thrive.
That's very helpful. Yeah.
Let me also add that in the law school context, some progress was being made toward implementing regulatory and legislative subjects. I mean, Landis as a faculty member was wanted and got appointed to a professorship in legislation. So this was building on Roscoe Pound, the young Pound's view of sociological jurisprudence and opening up legal education to more modern influences and more modern ways of thinking about the law. Unfortunately, like a lot of us, Pound became more rigid in his old age and got involved in some very unfortunate exchanges, particularly with Carl Llewellyn, in which his reactionary side came out, and the hopeful developments in the early period of Pound Steamship essentially were put on hold until the 1934 curriculum report, and Landis came in 1936. So only then really did the law school begin to reflect what was going on in the outside world.
Landis's idea of the cooperation between industry and the regulator is really part of, I think, the flaw. That because that gives industry access, and it has this sort of incestuous cooperation. I was a regulator actually, so I know that they have a lot of access, and I don't know what he thought about sort of establishing more of a barrier or either less access or more transparency, because there are a lot of meetings that happen in all those regulators' offices where things happen that nobody else ever sees. So did you talk about that?
Yes, very much so. And when you come to read the report that he gave to President-elect Kennedy in 1960, you see that Landis really begins to question the entire regulatory model, that the regulatory agencies were a very weak facsimile of what they were before. And one of the ways in which he wanted to address that was through the establishment of a public interest commissioner within each of the regulatory commissions, and that the sole purpose of this commissioner would be to assess to what extent major decisions were consistent with the public interest. Yes, they could be justified on technical grounds, but did they actually serve the public interest? So this would be an additional accountability mechanism that would be built into the system.
Fantastic. Well, we're actually right on time, which is a wonderful thing to say in academic settings. We're going to take a 5-minute break, and we're going to reconvene at 12:05 with our second panel. This is going to allow both an influx of some law students whose classes end in 2 minutes, and allow us a short break to grab some coffee. So we'll convene back here at 12:05, just a few minutes from now. So it's often said of a distinguished speaker that he or she needs no introduction. This is more rarely said of two speakers on the same panel, much less of two speakers who share the same last name. And yet this is the happy case for us today. We're delighted to have Judge Jed Rakoff of the Southern District of New York and Todd Rakoff, Byrne Professor of Administrative Law at Harvard Law School, with us today to lead and mediate a discussion about the administrative process as it was enunciated and developed by Landis, as well as some much more contemporary regulatory design questions. As I've suggested, both Jed and Todd have accomplished more than I can begin to mention here, but I will note that Todd has been a leader in innovative legal teaching at Harvard Law School, an innovator precisely, as we just heard, in the vein of Landis's own spirit. And he's recognized as a foremost expert in administrative law. Jed was recently listed by Fortune magazine as one of the world's 50 greatest leaders, and was described in another award ceremony as, quote, a legal thinker, scholar, and judge who not only elucidates and enforces the law, but interprets, defends, and challenges it in light of the principles of ethics and social justice that it's designed to serve. Someone whose opinions are cited as models of intellectual clarity and judicial vision by lawyers and judges throughout the nation. Now, their remarkable careers does lead me to wonder what was in the water of the Rakoff household as they grew up, and whether we can get the financial regulators to drink some of that too. But to lead our discussion today, we're going to return back to Justin O'Brien, who's going to set up the questions for our panelists, and then we'll hear brief remarks from Jed and Todd before opening up to a larger discussion.
Well, thanks very much indeed. I thought I'd start by going into a little bit more detail about Landis's fall from grace, because there's a hidden story here, which this book uncovers for the first time, in terms of how and why the prosecution took the form that it did. Now, it is the case, as Dan ably demonstrated in the first session, that Landis had, in actual fact, put aside the money for the payment of the taxes over a period of time. What happened to him, however, was that as part of normal vetting procedure within the administration, people were vetted to ensure whether or not their tax returns were up to date. What happened to Landis, however, was that the field officer conducting that investigation decided to communicate this directly to Joe Kennedy, rather than basically through official processes. So Joe Kennedy got in contact with Landis immediately and said, get your ass. He was very fond of the expletives, was Joseph, up to New York, and Kennedy helped Landis put together all of the taxes. But that wasn't the end of it, because what happened at that stage was, whilst the IRS in New York accepted that this was a voluntary filing, the IRS in Washington decided we needed further investigation. So Landis was brought in for questions at the IRS. And when asked, why did you do it? Why did you file? Landis very naively said, because Joseph Kennedy told me to. This was a critical mistake. As a consequence, justice felt it had no option and no alternative but to launch an investigation. And this is where the conflicts started to emerge. Because the director of the tax department only received his position because he was schooled in his confirmation hearings by Landis and felt that there was a conflict, and so therefore he couldn't make a decision. So then it was pushed up to the next level, to the head of the IRS itself, and the head of the IRS itself decided he couldn't make a decision because he owed his appointment to Robert Kennedy. And Robert Kennedy was the Attorney General, and of course Landis was the chief lawyer for the Kennedy family throughout the 1950s. So then the problem goes up another level, and of course Robert Kennedy himself could not be involved in the negotiations about how to deal with Landis. And so the entire operation of the case was transferred to Nicholas Katzenbach, who ultimately decided there was no alternative but to prosecute. Now, Richard Nixon was not the first president to secretly record conversations in his office. And hidden away in the JFK Presidential Library here in Boston is a really intriguing tape, which is a conversation between John F. Kennedy and Nicholas Katzenbach. And Kennedy says, if anybody out there gets the idea that the president's friends can get away with it, gosh, I think it would be an awful morale cracker to the Internal Revenue, to taxpayers. The next time that anyone gets arrested, they'll say, well, what the hell about Landis? So the decision was made that they would have to prosecute. Katzenbach said, not a problem. I will go up to New York, I will speak to Landis, and I will speak to his legal advisors, including his primary defense lawyer, who was Dean Warren from the Columbia Law School. When Katzenbach went up to speak to Landis and his advisors, they were presented with the very psychological defense that Dan referred to. And Katzenbach said, but this is totally impossible. Are you saying that you are going to put on the stand someone who was mad, someone who the president appointed to reorganize the regulatory agencies, and as a consequence of his recommendations, did reorganize the regulatory agencies. This is politically untenable. Justin Feldman, who was Landis's partner, said, well, that's what we're going to do. Katzenbach said, well, if you're going to do that, I want to speak to Landis directly. And he put the point directly to Landis. And Landis said, I think I've caused the administration too much embarrassment. I will plead guilty. That might have been the end of it, because the decision was then made that they could choose the date of the trial. And if that was the case, there was a possibility that they could get perhaps a sympathetic hearing. On the day of the sentencing, however, it turns out that the judge that they were expecting wasn't there, and in his place was the Chief Justice, Sylvester Ryan. And Sylvester Ryan gave a very hard-hitting, quite humiliating address for Landis. And nobody could really understand why he did so. Was it because he was a graduate of Fordham, and in his court was the former dean of Harvard Law School, defended by the current dean of Columbia Law School? Was it because Sylvester Ryan had been passed over by the Kennedys to an elevation to a higher court? Nobody was really quite sure. In 1981, just before he retired, Sylvester Ryan gave a very interesting account. And he said, for the New York Law Journal, and he said, quote, "What was so cruel? Here is a man who had enjoyed every advantage life can offer, while poor Irish and Jewish and Italian and colored kids were clawing their way out of the gutter. This guy was getting every break. Now, when he's been caught, the government slobbers over him, the Dean of Columbia Law slobbers over him, and everyone in the courthouse is falling over himself to make it easy for him. I had to do my duty, and my duty was to show that Landis was no better than anyone else." But that's not the end of the story. The prosecutor in the case is Robert Morgenthau, who is still practicing law in New York, and I went to see him. Jed very kindly effected an introduction. I went to see Morgenthau about this case, and he said it was a Greek tragedy. And it was a Greek tragedy because one of Landis's old colleagues, Tommy the Cork Corcoran, who was responsible for selling the Securities Act and Securities Exchange Act, was a very, very prominent lobbyist in Washington, went to the judge who was supposed to be hearing the case and said, "You do know the administration expects leniency." Ryan was determined to send a very clear, very unambiguous message that his court would not be interfered with. Landis was ultimately a victim of political expediency. Thank you.
So, first of all, let me say that it's a great pleasure to be back here and to sharing the desk here with what I always refer to as my smarter younger brother. And I also want to say that I think Landis was a great man, and this is a very great biography of him. But I say all that because I'm setting you up, because I am going to quibble with the point that has been made by both Justin and Daniel, that the prosecution of Landis was in some sense unfortunate or unfair or too severe or the like. Here are the facts. For 5 years, he failed to file his tax returns, there can be no question that he knew that he wasn't filing his tax returns. He never claimed, whatever his psychological infirmities, that he didn't know that he was supposed to file his tax returns and that he knowingly failed to do so. And he had a variety of different excuses. The first year, one of the papers he needed was not yet ready, although he could have sought an extension. And then it just became a slippery slope, and he was very busy because he was such an important man. But he only stopped, and he only actually paid his taxes for those 5 years when the IRS came to him and said, what's going on here? It was Justice Department policy then, as now, that if you pay up your taxes voluntarily before the IRS comes down on you, they will often exercise their discretion not to seek prosecution. But when you only pay up when you're caught, which is really what was his situation, then they will often recommend prosecution. And I think it was handled exactly right by Nicholas Katzenbach, who I think was one of the great public servants of our time, and by John F. Kennedy. In this wonderful tape that Justin found, John F. Kennedy is saying to Katzenbach, we can't put ourselves in the position where, because of political or familial or other reasons, we don't treat Landis the same way we would treat anyone else similarly situated. And I think that's right. Now, Morgenthau, who is one of my great heroes, Robert Morgenthau, offered Landis one thing that was not available. It would not be available today, but was sometimes available then. He offered him the opportunity to pick his judge shopping. He said, you can plead guilty in part one, that's the miscellaneous part of the court, and it's announced weeks in advance which judges are going to be in part one, and you can pick the one who will be the most sympathetic to you. By the way, my own view, although this could be debated, is that his so-called psychological defense would never have succeeded with any jury. It was too vague, it was, forgive me, but it was full of psychobabble. It was not, in my view, as a former criminal defense lawyer, a winning defense, but people could disagree about that. So they picked their judge with Morgenthau's consent, which was Judge McLean, one of the really great judges of the Southern District of New York. And then Tommy the Cork Corcoran, an old wheeler dealer from New Deal days, called up McLean, ex-party, totally improper, couldn't be more improper, and basically made a pitch for leniency for Landis. Now, no one knows, and I just asked Justin whether he knows, and he doesn't either, whether Landis knew about that. I'll assume he didn't know about it. It was more a reflection of the kind of guy Corcoran was, that he viewed the Southern District of New York court the way he would view some political deal in Washington, and that was a huge mistake. But the McLean, who was as honorable a judge as you will ever find, said, I've got to recuse myself because even though I didn't solicit this call, and even though I would not be affected by this call, there's the appearance issue, if it ever came out, that Corcoran had called me to urge leniency. Sylvester Ryan was the chief judge. It's a natural thing for the chief judge then to step in that situation. Sylvester Ryan gave him a 1-month sentence. Ironically, if you see the grossly draconian sentences that are handed down today under mandatory minimums and sentencing guidelines and the like, 1 month from that perspective looks like a very modest sentence. And putting it, because I personally find the sentencing guidelines and the mandatory minimums abhorrent, putting it even in terms of how things looked in those days, the prevailing criminological view in white-collar cases at that time was that you needed to have a short but real prison time for general deterrent effects. And every judge is commanded by legislation, as well as by common sense, to look, among other things, at general deterrence. So this was not a out of the ordinary sentence. It could have been less. My own view is that judges should take more account of personal circumstances, and I could well see a more sensitive judge giving him less, but I don't think it was by any means a severe sentence or out of proportion or anything else. And the long and the short of it is Landis was a great man. He knowingly and purposely broke the law by not filing his returns for 5 years, and I don't think that his prosecution under those circumstances was uncalled for.
Since I'm going to have to go to deliver this lecture, even though there are about 100 BC students that just hope to God I'm not going to show up, I'm going to say just one brief thing in reply, and it's only a question of fact. It's just an amazing fact. When Landis was released, I mean, he was a broken man. He had divorced his first wife and was living now with his second wife, who had been his secretary at Harvard Law School, in a house in Rye, New York. After he was found dead in the pool, she essentially gave up with the negotiations with the Internal Revenue Service. There was concern about penalties and concern about what was due. So the Internal Revenue Service took the house in Rye, in which Landis drowned in the swimming pool, and his last wishes was to have his ashes spread over the house in Rye, which indeed they were, as the Internal Revenue Service took possession of the house. Well, anyway, I think that's just a little moral for the Internal Revenue Service there.
So now you're sneaking out before I can reply.
Great to see you, Todd.
So I'm going to speak a little bit more about the general problem of regulation that the book addresses, and then I'm going to pass it back to Justin with a couple of questions, if I could. The terrific thing about this book is that it emphasizes how important it is to see regulation or administrative law as embedded in the overall culture of the society and not as standing alone. And I have two questions about how that interaction between regulation and the culture of the society come together. Landis's book, The Administrative Process, is famous for its argument that regulation is based on expertise, that that's what justifies having what would otherwise be called bureaucrats make decisions as opposed to elected officials. And he develops this as a way of allocating different tasks to different parts of the government. So, for example, he has a long discussion in the book about how judges have expertise as to interpreting the law, but administrative agencies, because they're working with the facts all the time, have a much better sense of what the actual reality is in a granular way, and that the division between what should be judicially reviewable and what the agencies should be able to decide on its own should be this question of comparative expertise. In legal parlance, it's the first great book of the legal process school. And as this book emphasizes, expertise in our society has to act against the background of the presumptive authority of the free market, of individual energy and risk-taking and individual choice as deciding a great part of our social choices. And the result of that, again, as the book says, is that the claims of expertise are not enough by themselves, that expertise has to be supported by political will. Now, this is, in a sense, paradoxical, because the claim of expertise itself to authority is that it's not political, that there actually is a right solution or a better solution that can be found in the facts. Now the claim is, but even that looking for a right solution or that looking for the impartial solution has to itself be based on a political will to look for the right solutions as opposed to the solutions that favor one constituency or another or something like that. The question I have for Justin on that, in terms of his program of reform, is it possible for an agency to count on continuous political support? What we seem to see often is a lot of political support at the time that an agency is set up or at the time a new statute is enunciated, and 5, 10, 20, 30, whatever number of years later, that political support dies away. And then what do we have left? How are the experts supposed to operate when the political support drains away? So that's my first question. My second question is based on another emphasis on the book, which I also think is absolutely right, which is that in terms of successful regulation, what you're really ultimately aiming at is changing the culture of the regulated party. That you really want the regulated party to internalize the norms of the system. And Landis's disclosure system was meant to achieve that. It was meant to encourage honesty and moral aspirations of people in the securities industry. But those rules came to be seen, as the book develops, as rules just to be formally complied with. So you could disclose everything that was required in a very formalistic way, and at the same time peddle your dross as if it was gold and get away with it. And the problem that I'd like you to address on that is it possible to change institutional culture if we also think that regulation should be consistent with the rule of law? Is it the way that the disclosure regulations, as you describe them, are being handled, is the way, well, it's the way we all think about the tax code, that you can arrange your affairs to be technically consistent with the tax code. You can't cheat, but you're allowed to go all the way up to the line and be as clever as you want. That's the, in many respects, the legal mentality or the rule of law mentality in action. If we think that regulation should not itself become management, should not itself take over the organization, should not itself try to control things the way managers try to control things which are not rule-bound, is there a way in which regulation can also be effective in changing the internal culture of the organization? Or to put the two things together, I mean, are our commitments to free enterprise, a free market, the rule of law, standing so much in the way of Landis's program, or of the modern version of it, that all we can have is a kind of a continuous series of standoffs, that the regulation will be effective in periods of high political mobilization, and then it will fall away, and then it will come back, and then it will fall away? Or is there something more permanent possible?
Great and difficult questions. Let me begin by answering the first question. Is it possible for regulatory authority to survive and thrive without political support? Answer is no. Landis' own career demonstrates that really quite clearly. He had the support of Roosevelt. He had, at best, ambivalent support from Truman and was forced out of the CAB, and he was partially rehabilitated by Kennedy. I think the same is true today. In fact, the problem has got much, much worse. The timescales are much, much shorter. There is a disconnect, if you will, between the regulatory cycle and the political cycle. So if you go back to 2002, for example, the passage of Sarbanes-Oxley, you had a degree of political support for regulatory action. But over the period 2002 to 2004, there was a period of business quiescence. 2004 to 2006, the narrative started to shift away from rogue executives to rogue regulators, that the United States was losing, New York in particular, was losing authority to London. London was becoming a bigger financial services center. As a consequence, this was a threat to the New York marketplace. There was a suggestion that we needed to develop a principles-based system of regulation here in the United States, such as the one that was used by the United Kingdom. Part of the problem here is that if you've got a rules-based system, the problem is the rules will be transacted around. However, the principles-based system has equal drawbacks in that, as Hector Sanz, a former head of the Financial Services Authority, put it very famously, I firmly believe in the value of principles-based regulation, but it doesn't work with people with no principles. and this is far from a facetious point, because in many ways we've been laboring under this bifurcation between rules versus principles, and we haven't really focused in on the social norms that hold together a given industry. And I think now there is a possibility of a reconnection between the regulatory cycle and the political cycle, precisely because industry practice has not changed after the global financial crisis. We are seeing with the LIBOR scandals and the FX market scandals, activity that is taking place irrespective of bailouts, irrespective of ownership, changed ownership of the banks. And the problem now is that the sovereign is bust. So if there is another financial crisis, the sovereign just isn't in a position to pay for another bailout. So what the United Kingdom has started to develop, and I think it's very, very interesting, is moving away from efficient markets and the efficient market hypothesis, and moving instead to a discourse based on fair and effective markets. And I think that in itself necessitates that we pay attention to what fairness means, what effectiveness means, and effectiveness must mean and must be related to purpose. And so there's an articulation now which is started by the Bank of England, is feeding into the Financial Stability Board, has been endorsed by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, of fair and effective markets linked to a conception of inclusive capitalism. And I think this is a kind of like a potential for change, but it'll only work if there is political support.
Go ahead.
So this is a very interesting debate and has important implications. I have to say that as a judge, rather than a member of the Academy, it's a little hard for me to grapple with some of what's being suggested here, because what a judge likes to see is how it plays out in specific instances as opposed to these broader generalizations. What I was struck, among many other things, in reading this wonderful book, was how so many of Landis's original aims had not come true, and how, to his credit, in the early 60s, he himself began to recognize this. He pointed attention to regulatory capture, which is still very much with us. He pointed a finger at the uncertain goals that many regulatory agencies have. They have their jurisdiction, but in terms of working out long-term goals, they're less savvy. He pointed out that they have a remarkable amount of discretion that is subject to the only most modest judicial review, let alone political review. In some ways, the political review is there to a greater extent. Today, there is remarkably little judicial review of agency practices. This has been troubling to a number of judges, including myself. But it is, there's the old famous Lord Acton cliche about power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. I think in the case of administrative agencies, it's not so much corrupting as leaving them somewhat unchecked and unbalanced. When you think about it in those terms, the whole regulatory regime is something quite different from what the Founding Fathers contemplated. They had a government that, as we all know from civics class, although I don't think any students ever, any high school students have civics classes today, but that it was a system of checks and balances that as the Federalist Papers make clear, it was believed by the Founding Fathers that self-interest would be the primary motivation. There would be factions, as they called them. And while, yes, those factions should operate within the law, it wasn't so much that they would be motivated by high principles or purposes, but rather that their competition would be subject to checks and balances in the form of government we had devised. Now, the regulatory system really operates, and Landis is very much responsible for this, on a different premise. The premise of the regulatory agencies is that the world is so complicated that we need experts, and we need experts who will be disinterested, who will have the public interest at heart, that this will attract, we hope, political support because they will be like little George Washington's, and so it will be, and I obviously overstating it, but this will be government by the regulators, for the regulators, etc. That's a very different view of how the government should operate from how the Founding Fathers contemplated. So how do we mesh those things together? No one suggests, and I certainly don't suggest, that there isn't a important need in modern society for regulatory agencies. I do suggest that there is need not so much for political support, though I understand the good arguments for that, but for political oversight and judicial oversight. I was struck by the following passage in Justin's book. He's explaining how Landis becomes, in the early 1960s, a little bit disenchanted with what, in effect, he had helped wrought. And he talks about he still believed in the delegation of a great deal of power to the regulatory agencies. Quote, "The delegation," he maintained, "remained necessary. The increased complexity of modern science society, the incapacity of Congress to devote the time or the resources to deal with them, and a conviction that the issues involved were different from and even further removed from those that theretofore had been traditionally handled by courts and thus were not suited for judicial determination, combined to necessitate an additional bulwark provided by the administrative process," close quote. Well, as you can imagine from my own self-seeking, self-serving standpoint, when I saw that, not suited for judicial determination, baloney. And in many ways, the great magic, if you will, the great secret of the American judiciary has been their ability, like other unexpert but reasonably intelligent people, once they hear the facts of a case, to determine where justice lies in that case. So, a long-winded way of saying that while I do not disagree with the notion that administrative agencies cannot be fully successful without political support, and while I also share my brother's questions about how you achieve this, I think that we need, in the very long run, to be concerned with how much of the governance of this country we delegate to administrative agencies.
Well, being a professor of administrative law, I can't just let that go. Well, just I don't disagree with some of what you're saying. I would just
this is different from history, by the way.
Let me just start by saying the administrative law judges of the Social Security Administration. That's not an Article III judge like my brother. That's an administrative process. The administrative law judges of the Social Security Administration hear and decide more cases than all the federal and state judges put together on a yearly basis. So if you're talking, and that's just one agency, it's a big agency in terms of cases, but if you're talking about bringing everything into court, you're talking about a quite remarkable change in the way things are done that might give you a lot of cases that you wouldn't want to hear.
Although I got to interrupt for a second and say that Social Security decisions are appealable to the federal district courts, and we have a whole lot of them, which I immediately delegate to the magistrate judges. But
well, I made a mistake in pausing there. Speaking more broadly about the problem, I think the quotation you were reading about delegation is really problematic, and it may be a thing where the common interpretation has really got this thing wrong. The way that people who are in favor of regulation have generally looked at delegation is to think that the broader the delegation to the agency, the better it was, the more pro-regulatory it was. And that the people who insisted or suggested that Congress should be more specific and that the legislation wasn't good if it wasn't specific were basically old fuddy-duddies trying to redress their argument in rule of law terms. But I think that may be the wrong way to cast the argument. When the delegation comes across, when all the Congress does is something very, very general, I think that probably, in fact, what it has done is creates a weak agency. So for instance, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, the Occupational Safety and Health Act, basically says we as Congress decide two things. One, if an employer does something which is going to potentially kill an employee, that's illegal. And two, for anything else, we'll just leave it to the agency to invent whatever rules they think they want. Well, OSHA is a weak agency, in part as a result of that. It becomes the agency that is lampooned. How could they say we needed a 10-foot ladder instead of an 8-foot ladder, or those kinds of things? They're constantly running into a question as to where is their authority. So it may be that one substitute for continuous political support would be much more precise statutes that give a much better idea of what Congress has in mind. Now, of course, that immediately, in today's circumstances, runs into the problem that if you're looking for incompetence in Washington, Congress might be the first thing on your list, not the last thing on your list. And so that may be at least in the short term, a unrealistic way to do it. But in the longer term, it seems to me that might be the way to go.
So I agree with that, and what I would suggest that it implicitly posits is that Congress has some overall degree of expertise, which can be exercised then in more specific legislation. No one supposes that Congress needs to know every nitty-gritty about whether someone qualifies for Social Security in an individual case, but Congress, in making more detailed legislation, in effect, makes the policy decisions that under our form of government should be made by the people elected by the people. And similarly, when you have a detailed piece of legislation, then when the agency exercises its expertise to implement that, and it's challenged in court, the judge has some standard in which to judge it. Something particular, he can say, yes, you followed out that particular mandate, or no, you did not. So I think it's a double win for how good agencies should proceed.
I hate to intervene in this familial debate, but I mean, it strikes me that looking at Landis, he wasn't seeking necessarily to supplant the judiciary. He was just simply suggesting that the administrative process has a legitimate role to play, and in the right circumstances has basically the capacity to make those decisions. Part of the problem, linking into Todd's point, is if you look at recent legislation in the security space, such as Dodd-Frank, for example, so much discretion was left to the SEC in terms of implementing studies, etc., that the SEC was put in an almost impossible position. And I remember speaking at a conference in Sydney, and the head of KPMG's Center of Excellence for Regulatory Studies flew in from Washington and said, Dodd-Frank, this is legislation we've got to fight against clause by clause. Right? So the SEC has found itself in an almost impossible position since Dodd-Frank basically was implemented. And of course, that then has ongoing implications in terms of what it deems to be effective settlements, or as you would say, the privileging the facade of enforcement against recidivist offenders. I love these lines, right? But it seems to me that what Landis would be thinking in terms of, well, how do you address the problems of cultural failings within the financial institutions would be simply to argue, I don't care what you say your culture is, I just need to find a mechanism to be able to hold you to account if in actual fact your practice is at variance from your stated values. And that is a much more easily justified regulatory approach than the approach that it's adopting at the moment.
If I could ask you a comparative question. In parliamentary systems, by definition, the executive has a legislative majority. And so does the situation look very different there? It ought to, in principle, be easier to handle, but I'm wondering if it is.
No, unfortunately not, because the economically rational is in itself a kind of like a political construct which transcends national boundaries.
Well, it's most unfortunate. It sounds like we're all reaching a consensus. What fun is that? But I do agree that Dodd-Frank has proven to be an albatross for the SEC. Endless numbers of rules that they were just blindly told, go fix this, go fix that. They have to hear from all the special interests. That's not wrong. It's appropriate that before any rule is put in place, that all the affected people have a chance to be heard. But they're not being heard, so to speak, in the same way that special interests are heard through the election of representatives to Congress. They're being heard in very specific lobbying that with some agencies is very effective. The SEC has a history of independence that is fortunately less receptive to that, but not totally. And so there are still, I think, something like a couple of hundred of regulations that the SEC was supposed to pass under Dodd-Frank that they still haven't formulated, and I don't blame the SEC on that. It was just kind of Congress saying, you take care of it, we wash our hands of it.
We're conscious of the audience. Does anybody like to ask any questions, Larry?
Yeah, so this is a question for Judge Rakoff.
I'm the judge, but he's the judicious one. But
okay, so it builds off a suggestion that we think about the culture in the context of this regulation. And I wonder whether there's a certain elephant in the room that even Landis wouldn't have been aware of in thinking about the culture of regulation. I was thinking about it a lot in reaction to your really fantastic essay in the New York Review of Books about the failure to prosecute in the context of the financial crisis. The part that I think about that wasn't really in that essay was the kind of reality that if the Democratic Party took on Wall Street in a context where Wall Street was the largest contributor in the context of congressional elections, that was a certain self-willed death. And so to the extent there's a kind of reality of how far you can go in a world where elections are as competitive as they are and financed in the way that they are, the missing part to the story is there is no independence, sufficient independence even for an administration to be as strongly willed against such a powerful body as there would have been even at the time that Landis was thinking in the early 1960s about what's necessary for the capacity of a regulatory agency to do its job. And I just wonder whether we're allowed to talk about that, or whether it's allowed to be part of the calculation, because you're very careful, and I think you were right in your essay, to discount the suggestion that prosecutors were thinking about the revolving door, or that people inside of the agency would be thinking in that crude way. I think that's got to be correct. But the bigger question, especially in the context not of regulating airlines, but in the context of regulating something like Wall Street, is whether we've lost the ability for a government agency to stand up to this kind of power when they realize that, in the next 2 years, that could be the end of their continued capacity to govern.
So it's a very good question. Let me start with a small part of it and then move to the bigger part. The small part, the revolving door, you're right, I do think that is an unfair or overstated criticism. It's not that it's totally wrong, but we want it both ways. We want our regulators to have hands-on practical experience, which in most cases mean they would have had private employment at some point. And yet we say, oh my God, there's another regulator who came out of private industry. No wonder he or she is not being tough on that industry. The broader point about our ability to deal with entire important industries, certainly there was an element in the Justice Department's original view of alleged fraud in the financial crisis of we can't go after the banks because it'll hurt the economic recovery. Attorney General Holder, although he has since recanted, said that more or less explicitly at the time. The one thing that I view as hopeful is that there was and has been a substantial public outcry. The reaction of the Justice Department is perhaps not the ideal one, and in any event comes very late. And that is all these settlements that you've seen in the last year or so, with umpteen billions being paid by various banks for various wrongdoings in connection with the financial crisis. I don't think that would have happened without public outcry. I really think it's more or less simple cause and effect. At the same time, in my view, it's not nearly as effective nor really as fair as the much harder job of finding out who was personally responsible for the particular frauds alleged and going after that person or persons criminally, which I think has much more deterrent effect, creates much more cultural impact in the sense of promoting a positive culture, a principled culture. When you have these great big settlements involving the banks in terms of money, of course, the money is being paid by the shareholders. Whatever benefit they may have received from the wrongdoing, they certainly weren't the ones orchestrating it. From the bank standpoint, it's a question of how much we have to pay in order to make peace with the regulators, or in this case, the Department of Justice. It sends some positive messages, but I don't think it's nearly as effective as would have been going after individuals, and I mean high-level individuals who I think, at least according to the Department of Justice's own evidence, were culpable. The statute of limitations has now largely run, and query whether even at this late date it would have had the same effect as it would have had much earlier. So there's a lot to what you say, but I think In fact, the evidence is that public opinion did play a role in the end, maybe not soon enough, maybe not enough, but did play a role.
I think also linked to that is that the broader economic factors governing basically the operation of the economy have changed dramatically from 2008. So it is possible for the Department of Justice in particular to take a much more aggressive stance now than it did in 2008 when we had a question mark over the survival of the global economy. And I think what we're seeing now with the LIBOR and Forex settlements is much more emphasis not just on fines, but also looking at how culture within the organization itself can actually be changed, in part through the imposition of external monitors. And I think that is also linked with there will be criminal prosecutions for individual traders.
And I can't speak much about this because I have one of the LIBOR cases pending before me now, but I will just note that in that case, the government did name individuals. So that sounds to me like maybe they've learned their lesson, so to speak.
We should get some more questions or other hands.
Yes, I'm right at the back.
So I have a question that is directed first to Todd about the nature and task of administrative law. And to explain my question, I want to put it in the setting of the issue of finance that is figured in our conversation. So I take it that the dominant view is that if there is a problem in finance, it must arise from some localized defect in the capital markets, some localized market imperfection, such as an asymmetry of information, or in a localized regulatory failure of the response to the localized market defect. Now, I'll just state dogmatically that I think this view is entirely mistaken, and that if there had been much closer regulatory vigilance than there had been, nothing fundamental would have changed in the trajectory of the crisis of 2007, 2009 in the United States or anywhere else. And that the problem is rather in the arrangements that now organize the relation of finance to the real economy. So finance is relatively detached from the real economy. Most of the production system, most of production is internally financed within the production system by the retained and reinvested earnings of private firms. And finance is then, under those arrangements, allowed to be a bad master rather than a good servant of the productive agenda of society. So then you think the real problem is reorganizing the relation of finance to the real economy so that it is made more effectively to serve the productive agenda of society. And under that alternative agenda, administrative law or the administrative process would have a completely different vocation, different from the premise of this conversation, and different from what we have heard about the ideas of Landis and the idolatry of expertise. So if there are to be interventions that reshape the relation of finance to the real economy, they have to be worked out in detail. And the legislative interventions would be simply the first step, and then a second step would occur in this regulatory process. So the regulatory process would serve the project of institutional reinvention, in this case, reinvention of the relation of finance to the real economy. And it would generate a series of experiments or observations that could in turn inform the legislative reinvention. So my question is, whether this alternative view has any purchase on current ideas and debates in administrative law, or whether administrative law thinking continues to be entirely beholden to this conception that I regard as radically mistaken.
I'm not an expert.
You can answer yes or no.
Roberto, I'm not an expert in financial regulation, but I do think probably the closest example in the history of American administrative law is the one that Justin talks about in his book, the Public Utility Holding Act, that forced the total reorganization of the whole way in which utilities were capitalized. So there is that, in the body of administrative law, there is that possibility out there. I don't think that anybody, well, I can't speak for I can't say anybody. I would say you are right that the dominant thrust of administrative law right now is not in that direction. But I would say it's another example of where the political will has to be there. I mean, whether it's for the kind of things that Larry is working on, financing of elections or otherwise, I don't think that people think that's going to happen. And most scholars are not utopian, maybe more should be, but most tend to work on the things that they think are likely to happen. That's the best I can do for you on your question.
Yeah, I think what's interesting is at a global regulatory level, the conversation is actually shifting dramatically towards basically recognizing the problem that you've identified. So this is not just the comments from Mark Carney, this is also Christine Lagarde, it's also William Dudley in New York. And just today we launch Fixing the Fix, Culture, Ethics, and the Expanding Perimeter of Regulatory Intervention, which is our 52nd working paper, I think, which speaks directly to those issues and how regulatory authorities are thinking about this as a reconceptualizing of regulatory purpose linked to a shackling, if you will, of finance to society in a way that they've been unshackled in the past. But I'm very conscious we've reached the end. I want to thank everybody for coming, particularly Jed and to Todd and to Dan, who was here earlier, and of course to Larry and to the team at Safra. Thank you very much indeed.